Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for tuning into my talk, and welcome to DevOps Pro. If you're just tuning in now, or if you've been seeing other talks, then great stuff. Please stay tuned. Looks like there are a number of great things that are going on. And so I'm going to be presenting to you on automating React deployments to S3 and CloudFront. S3 and CloudFront are both services in AWS. S3 is a service that allows you to store objects, and a great part about this is that it also allows you to enable static site hosting for sites like React, Angular, etc., which are which would fall in the category of SPAs, or single page applications, and you'd be able to build them and store all the statics in that storage bucket in S3, and you'd be able to serve it the same way that you would, and that can actually operate as your runtime environment. And in addition to that, very important would be that you can also set up a distribution network in front of it for optimal performance and for caching as well. And so I'll be showing you how to do that using Terraform, building a CI/CD pipeline, and we'll also have a quick squiz at the React application that we'll be building. There's not going to be too much in there. The main thing is to actually show you how to build out the relevant resources in Terraform and deploying them to the AWS cloud. So just a bit about myself. My name is Lukonde Mwila, or you can call me Luke, and I'm a senior software engineer at Intellect in South Africa. And I'm also an AWS container hero, and I'm 5 times certified. Previously, I worked a lot in the web and mobile application space, and have since transitioned into more of cloud and DevOps. And I currently consult in the financial services sector, doing a lot of cloud architecture, security, and building of infrastructure, so your automation engineering, etc., primarily in the AWS landscape. And so something that I love to do when presenting on these kinds of technical talks is to give you a bit of a bird's eye view of what we're actually going to be doing. I did touch on it earlier, and essentially we're creating the kind of workflow that you would want to have if you happen to be in a team where you are building a front-end application and you want to have a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline and workflow to streamline things, and to make sure that you are essentially you're speeding up the process of what you put out into the customer's hands in terms of your application, or what end users get to experience. But not only that, you want to make sure that it is quality, and that's what continuous integration is also trying to help you achieve. And so there are a number of great tools that help you get there. And so today I'm going to be showing you how to do that using particular tools in the AWS space, using Code Build as our CI tool, our continuous integration tool. And what Code Build is it's actually just it's a CI tool, but it has a container that it runs. And so the same commands that you'd be running locally on your machine when you're building your application are essentially the same commands that you'd be running through in Code Build as well. So you'd create a Code Build project, and we'll take a look at that, and it will run these commands for you. And the main thing that you want to do over here before building your application is to also test it to make sure that you're only putting out quality code. And so the source for this will be GitHub, and we have a GitHub repository, which I'll show you in the next slide. And so that will be the source for our pipeline. And for the actual CI/CD tool, I use container here loosely, the container for our source stage and our build deploy. That if you look at that rectangle over there in the diagram for our project in the picture, that will be code pipeline, which essentially is what will be our flow from source to build and deploy. And so this may look a little bit different from your traditional CI/CD pipelines. If you're familiar with building these out, there is no separate deploy stage. Instead, we've got build and deploy happening inside of Code Build. And what we're going to be doing inside of our Code Build container is we'll be working with what is known as a build spec configuration file, which is what will allow us to run the tests on our application, build it out, and then simply upload it to an S3 bucket, because as I mentioned earlier, S3 allows us to configure it for static site hosting. And so all of our static assets that get built and produced from that React application will be uploaded to S3. And our website is going to be fronted by this distribution network. We're going to be using Cloudfront for that. And you can configure Cloudfront for caching, which will just also produce a much, what reduces latency and produces a much better experience for your end users. And so, as I mentioned, I'm going to be working with a GitHub repository. As you can see over here, this repository is public, so please feel free to go ahead and make use of this. I've added a license to it, so you can do with it as you please, and I find that it's usually a lot easier to follow along with these kinds of technical talks, for you to be able to see what I'm dealing with and have it also open on your end if you're able to carry out both items. And so you'll notice that I've structured my my repository over here, specifically the source code in it, with client application, infra-live, and infra-modules. And if you're not too sure what the infra-modules, and infra-live is at this point, I'll get into that, but it's essentially a mono repo over here that we have that has everything that we need. That doesn't mean that you have to structure it this way if you're working with a similar kind of project. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to share with you VS Code, and this project will be open over there, and we'll do a walkthrough, and we'll take it from there. All right, so you should be seeing my VS Code at this point, and over here is my project. And as I mentioned, you can go ahead and clone this to make use of it over here. I've also put the architecture diagram in it, so you can make use of this as a reference. And so if you're completely new to Terraform, Terraform is essentially a language by HashiCorp. It is an infrastructure as code tool, which will allow us to automate the building out of our infrastructure. And this is it's a really important tool, and infrastructure as code tools are increasing in popularity more and more because they help us enable having immutable infrastructure. And if you've never heard of that term before, immutable infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean that our infrastructure never changes. Immutable infrastructure is a safer way for us to have discrete versioning, and for us to be able to test out the infrastructure that we deploy into our cloud environments. And so if you think about it, with this particular case, you know, if I were to use the example of a mutable architecture, if you were to do some kind of upgrade, if you're running an application on a virtual machine, you would still have some automated scripts or tools that you could use, like Chef or Puppet, to do this upgrade for your virtual machine and any underlying software over there, as well as the application. But if something goes wrong, then you may be stuck in between your ultimate desired state or the second version of your infrastructure, and you get caught in between. And that might seem like it's not a biggie when you're dealing with a small application and a small scale infrastructure setup. But when you're dealing with a large number of instances and then enterprise architecture, it becomes a lot more complex and a lot more difficult. And so immutable architecture is a lot safer. And so with Terraform, we can easily spin up everything that we want, and we can tear it down. And so the immutable in there simply means that whatever is running will be completely replaced by a whole new set of architecture, and that can be tested in and of itself. And it also allows us to version our architecture. And so that's one of the motivation factors as well for making use of Terraform. And also when it comes to deployments in the DevOps space, you might have heard of the model of us being able to make use of just simply laying out our desired state, and that's something that Terraform also helps us achieve, as opposed to following a more procedural approach. We can follow this model that Terraform gives us, where it would simply be defining what we want, and under the hood, it takes care of making all the relevant API requests to set up the infrastructure for us. Okay, and so I have the client application folder over here, which is the React application, and we'll take a look at that last. We will start off with looking at the infra modules folder first. And so modules in Terraform, again, I'm going to use the word container loosely here, not to be confused with Docker containers or containers that are actual processes. In this case, it is simply a logical grouping of resources that you want to have deployed together. And so I have logical groupings around my CI/CD pipeline. There are a lot of resources that go into that. There is my code pipeline, a resource that will be created. There's my code build project, and along with a few other items which we'll look at. And then there's the folder which I've called web app, which is a separate module. And this is what will contain resources for the S3 bucket, IAM, which will have security related permissions for us, and also our Cloudfront distribution. And then once we're done with the modules, we'll take a look at this folder that I've created, Infra Live, and I'm making use of a tool called Teragraph, which is a wrapper for Terraform, and it allows us to essentially streamline a number of the commands that we would otherwise be running in Terraform as well. And not only that, it makes our code dry, which is a main thing allows us to do. And by dry, I simply mean don't repeat yourself. And that's great when you want to be able to deploy the same modules to multiple environments. So you can see over here, we've got dev, prod, and UAT. And so we'll be able to take a look at the configuration files over there. And once we've done that and taken a look at our client's application, I'll show you what this looks like in the cloud environment itself and show you the different, the end results. And so let's take a look at our modules. I'm going to start over here by showing you the main file. And so inside of the web app, in the main file over here, you can see we've got this module that we've created. And the module, like I said, a logical grouping or a container for different resources. And it also allows us, so firstly, we'd have to point it to a particular source. And I should mention, it doesn't have to be a local source. In this particular case, it is. It's pointing to the front end folder. If you have your module in a separate repository, you can still, that could still work, and you can enter it over here as a source, whether your repo is in GitHub or Bitbucket, etc., and you'd specify the source over there. But also inside of a module, a specific folder, like in this case, front end, we've got our variables file, which will have a bunch of different variables, and we can populate those variables at the module level as well over here, as you can see, filling in a couple of blanks and just populating the relevant variables with the desired properties. This is something that we can also achieve at the Teragraph configuration file level, and I'll show you that. But just in case you're wondering what's going on over here, that's what we're setting up. And so I'm going to start off with taking a look at the S3 bucket. And so I typically tell people that if they have some kind of programmatic background or experience with doing development, then picking up Terraform isn't that difficult in terms of the syntax. What I think is the real learning curve when it comes to Terraform projects for enterprise architecture is how you structure your project, how you structure your code is the real thing. Because if you see, if this could potentially become a very large scale project and you're going to be managing a number of resources and how you set that up, then you really want to give enough thought to how you structure your modules, etc. But otherwise, it is well, I think it's well documented. And so you'd be able to easily get a good understanding of it. And so over here, we've got the S3 bucket resource, which I'll be creating. And there are a couple of things that I'll say that are, would relate more to someone who may be completely new to Terraform, just so it fills in that blank in case you have any questions. And so this is how we define the specific resource we want to create. This is the type of resource we want to create. And the second property over here is the name of the resource that we're giving. This is completely arbitrary, whereas this is the actual definition so that Terraform knows this is the type of resource that I'll be creating. And as I mentioned earlier, Terraform runs all the relevant APIs under the hood, making the API requests to AWS. And so in this particular resource that I'm creating, there are some properties. Now, with all resources, you have mandatory properties and optional properties, depending on what your use case is and what you're trying to set up. So in this case, I have a bucket name, and I have an ACL, which is an access control list that I'm trying to set up. And I've set this as variables, and I'll open this vars file over here so you can get an idea of what's getting set up over there. And then we've also got this policy, which you can see over here, and that relates to the IAM identity and access management for the permissions that we want to set up for our bucket. Now, this bucket is going to have a number of public properties in this particular case, because I'm going to be storing in it the static resources of my React website, which I do want to have public and accessible. And then also, when you're setting up a static, when you're configuring your S3 bucket to be to act as a website, you would populate this website property over here with these relevant fields, letting it know what the index document is, in this case index.html, and the error document also being index.html. And in case you're wondering why that is the case, if you're again familiar with single page applications, then you're only dealing with one index file, which gets injected with all of your JavaScript code, and all the relevant components that will be loaded onto it essentially, and you'll render it based on the routing that you set up. So both the 404 error page will still ultimately be displayed based on your index.html file, because that's where all the React code gets injected. And then over here, just a property to set whether or not you want to version your S3 bucket. And then just a good practice is to always have some tags with the different resources you'll be creating, just to make it easier to identify them. And you can also make use of tags for a number of different things that you may want to do with some kind of reporting, or if you want to see billing reports, etc., on the AWS side of things, and you want to be able to filter as well based on particular tags. Okay, and so each one of these properties, as you can see, with the variables, I don't want to bore you too much when it comes to by going through every variable in detail. But so I'll mostly hone in on it on this particular one, but not so much when looking at the other resources, just so if you're inexperienced with Terraform, you get to have an idea of, okay, that's how you'd structure your variables. But again, I don't think there's much of a learning curve. If you have programmatic experience, you'd simply define the type of your variable. If you do have a specific kind of default value that you want to set up, so for the bucket access control list, I'm setting up mine to private, and then you can give it a description as well, just to make it easier to understand what the purpose of that variable is. And so, like I mentioned earlier, those variables can be populated either with a default value, or you can populate them at the module level, as I've done over here, or thirdly, in the Teragraph config level, if you are making use of Teragraph. And I should just mention quickly that you don't have to make use of Teragraph. I'm making use of a Terraform Community Edition over here. If you're making use of Terraform Enterprise, then the need may essentially fall away. But Teragraph is very useful if you're using a Community Edition and you want to have a dry approach, like I mentioned, and easily set up for multiple environments. And then over here, we have an IAM policy document for our S3 bucket. And in this case, I'm using setting up a data resource. And so this is my policy statement for my S3 bucket. And so I'm essentially allowing the objects which will be stored in my S3 bucket to be retrieved through GET request, as you can see over here, or rather the getting of those objects, which is the action that I've allowed over here. And I'm making this pretty open. And the resource, I specify that it'll be for this particular bucket. So if you're familiar with how identity and access management works in AWS, then you know a good practice is obviously you want to limit the permissions that you go with. And so in this case, we don't want to use a very open policy document that is applied to all resources. We want to nail it down to this particular bucket that we are setting up. Okay, and then we have Cloudfront Distribution. And so this is for our distribution network that is going to be in front of our S3 bucket. And as you can see over here, a couple more properties compared to our S3 bucket. So I'm going to start from the top. And so we set up the origin for our distribution network. And you can see over there our domain name. And so this is something that we get from our S3 bucket. And so I'm just going to open this over here. So in Terraform, you can reference other resources which makes things very nifty. And so again, just going back to that logical grouping, you can start to see how these two relate to each other in the context of what we're trying to set up. And so I can get the domain name by referencing this particular resource, which is over here, the AWS S3 bucket. But because of the particular property name that I've set it up with, it will get this bucket domain name value from this particular resource. And so now you may be asking the question, well, where does bucket domain name come from in this context? So each time that a resource is created, it will actually export certain values. So you'll always have an ARN, an Amazon resource name, which essentially operates like the identity for the resource that you would have created in AWS. And so bucket domain name is one of the properties that would be exported from our S3 bucket, and we can make use of it over here. And then we define that the origin ID is that this is a website. And so another nifty thing with Terraform is when you run the relevant command Terraform apply to set up your infrastructure, Terraform will know the relevant order or the right order to set up to create the different resources. So in this case, our Cloudfront distribution is obviously dependent on our S3 bucket being created in order for that bucket domain name to actually be exported and to exist. So Terraform will run the S3 bucket creation process first, and only when that is done will it then proceed to create the Cloudfront distribution network. And so I proceed to enable it. You can disable it if you desire to do so, and then enable it at a later point. But I enable it from the get-go. And the default root object is in my index.html file in the S3 bucket. And then you can also set up caching. This is one of the main reasons for using a distribution network, to provide a much better experience for any end users. And as you can see over here, you can provide it with the allowed methods that you want to have run. Now, again, this may be use case specific in terms of the type of application you're running. But in this case, assuming that you're running a application which will typically have CRUD processes, then you will likely have all of your typical HTTP methods that you can run against it, as you can see over here. And you can also set up the cached methods that you want. In my case, get and head requests. And again, setting up just the target origin ID. In this case, obviously, it is a website. And then I'm not setting up any particular forwarded values or setting up any cookies, because it's a very basic React application that I'm setting up. And then also really cool, you can redirect to HTTPS, which is another thing that I'm setting up, which is great, again, just for security purposes for your application. And then obviously setting up the specific caching behavior with the time to live, as you can see over here. And this is also going to be something that will be specific based to what you're setting up. And then if you do want to restrict any accessibility to your application based on geographic locations, that's another thing that you can set up over here with the particular restrictions. And there are additional things that you could do with Cloudfront in terms of behavior and where you want to redirect users as well. It may be based on a country or just a specific location, or a specific type of website that may have been designed for a particular location. Cloudfront allows you to set all of that up, so it is really nifty. And then, as mentioned before, even like I'm doing with my S3 bucket, I'm setting up some tags over here, just so it's easy to identify this particular resource and what I'm making use of it for. And then for the certificate, I'm using the default Cloudfront certificate. And so this module essentially would be ready to go. You can go ahead, and this is something that you'd be able to run apply against, and it would set up the S3 bucket and the Cloudfront distribution. And so in my case, I've already set them up, and this was the first module that I deployed so that my pipeline doesn't fail. Because if I was to create my pipeline before I created the S3 bucket and the Cloudfront distribution, as much as those resources would be created later on, the pipeline would fail, because in the code build stage, it would essentially be trying to deploy the React application to an S3 bucket that wouldn't exist at that point in time. So you'd want to create these resources first. And so that's kind of our web app in a nutshell, the front-end specific resources that you would be creating from Cloudfront distribution, the relevant IAM permissions for your S3 bucket, and the S3 bucket itself. And so like I showed you right to begin with when we started diving into the code, our main.tf file is what contains the module. itself for our front-end environment, as I'm calling it over here. All right, and then next up, I'm going to show you the module for our CI/CD pipeline. I'm going to open the main.tf file. And so you can see over here, I've got my module for the front-end pipeline, a couple of more properties that I'm setting up over here. And that is because there are a lot more resources that we're dealing with when creating the front-end pipeline, or the properties themselves, or the resources rather themselves, have a lot more properties to be set up. And we'll go through those in a few minutes. I just want to give you a quick overview over here. Now, in case you're very new to Code Pipeline and you're wondering, well, how would we configure Code Pipeline to integrate with our repository when it's when it's GitHub, which is outside of the AWS network and the AWS environment. It's an independent platform where we get to store our source code. And so what I have done is, inside of another service that AWS has called Secrets Manager, you can store sensitive information in there. And so I'm storing my GitHub secret. And so you can head over to GitHub, and in the settings file for accessibility, you can create a token. And that token is to grant access to to your repositories. You can define how much access you want to give it. You want anyone that has access to that token to have. And so in my case, I generate that token, and then I store the value of that token in AWS Secrets Manager. And what that allows me to do in Terraform is I can essentially reference the relevant secret. And what Terraform will do using these data resources over here with Secrets Manager secret and secret version is it will make use of that secret and get the particular token, so that when I'm actually running my Terraform command, or the execution of the plan, what it will do is it will actually fetch that token, and it will be able to authenticate with GitHub and pull that through, so that we can be able to configure that our code pipeline source to our GitHub repository to essentially give it the relevant permissions to pull that as a source. If you don't set that up, then obviously that will, your source and code pipeline won't be able to speak to GitHub. And so just like I did with the front end module, I have a source which is local. In this case, it's called front end pipeline. And then I've given my application a name just to make it easier to identify the relevant resources once I've created them. And then I'm also, in my code build project, I have a couple of environment variables, and an important one is the S3 bucket destination. And so this is the S3 bucket URI, so that it knows where to upload the resources to, and I provide that as an environment variable. And then you also can set up a bucket for your pipeline where all of the dependencies that you installed while the pipeline is running, specifically in the CI stage, will be stored and cached. And the reason why that's important is because the first time your pipeline runs, it's actually going to take a bit of time, because it'll be making requests to, depending on what dependencies you're pulling in, and it will take a little bit of time to pull all those dependencies and install them. In this case, it will be node package management dependencies. And moving forward, though, those dependencies get cached in the bucket in this S3 bucket that you create, the pipeline bucket, and it will make use of the cached dependencies so that any subsequent pipeline runs will be a lot faster. Okay, and so I just provide some additional details, such as the repository name, and this is relevant so that Code Pipeline knows the GitHub repo that it should be pulling from. And I've created another property. Again, these properties are based on variables, except for source, of which is that I mentioned earlier, that points to the source for our module. And so branch name, and this is important because when I go over the Teragraph configuration files, I'll show you how you can essentially, what we're going to be doing in this case as well, setting up for 3 different environments: dev, user acceptance testing, and production environments. Each one of them will be sourced ultimately back to a specific branch. And so the repository that I have over here, Automate React Deployments to S3 and CloudFront, has 3 branches. There's the develop branch, UAT, and main and the main branch as well. And the main branch is used for production. UAT and develop, as you would guess, are for each of those respective environments. Okay, and so I'm gonna head over to this folder over here, and I'm gonna start with the code build project. And so with this resource that I'm creating, as I mentioned, code build is for your continuous integration. Some of the properties are a bit of a no-brainer. You'd give your code build project a name, a description. You'd provide it with a service role, and this is to give code build the relevant permissions for what it should be able to carry out. And if I recall, mine would be pretty open. And so if I scroll down over here, you'll see the IAM role and policy for code build. And so I'm creating a trust relationship with this IAM role and the service code build itself. And then I attach policies for particular permissions that I wanted to have. And so like I mentioned earlier, code build essentially runs a container, but that container is running on an EC2 instance. So you want to give it the relevant permissions to EC2 instances. And also we want to be able to view the logs for our code build project when it's running, so we can see what's happening. And so we want to be able to create the relevant logs in CloudWatch, and for those to also be streamed through to code build. And so those would be the permissions. Those are the additional permissions I'm adding over here. And then a little bit open over here, not a little bit, very open. So definitely you can narrow these permissions down, but I'm also creating a policy statement to give code build permissions to access, to carry out any action with S3. And the main ones that you want over here is obviously to have the permissions to be able to upload the static content that gets generated when the CI stage is run, to deploy them through to the code build, to deploy them through to the relevant S3 bucket. And then also all the different permissions that I want my IAM role to have with code build itself, and the different things that I want to be able to run. And so I'll come back to this IAM file just to go over the pipeline finish. But for now, I just want to finish going through this code build resource. You can also define the artifact types in terms of what gets, in terms of your artifact that is moving on code pipeline. This isn't that important in this particular case because we are building our static content in our pipeline and quickly uploading it to S3. This is a little bit different compared to if it was a different kind of application, and our artifact that gets built and moving that perhaps to a deploy stage, or storing that artifact for example, in an S3 bucket. And so like I mentioned earlier as well, so the caching that happens, we create an S3 bucket for that, so that any of the dependencies that get installed during the CI stage can be reused later. Now, a very important component when it comes to making use of code build is what is known as a build spec file, which is the configuration file that essentially tells code build the relevant commands that we want to run. And not only that, the runtime environments that we want to have, anything that we would want to have installed. So you'd basically, for example, if you're able to build the application locally on your machine, based on the different environments that you have, over the environment setup you have in terms of any software you have installed, and even the operating system, etc. That all those are things you can configure to run in your build stage, so that you have a very similar environment. And then lastly, over here would be the environment setup that you'd have. You can choose the compute type for your code build project. And in my case, I'm setting up a Linux container, and I'm using a code build image. You can provide it with your own image if you want to build one. And then very important environment variables. So in my case, I'm setting up an environment just so I can, adding an env environment variable just so I can be able to identify this is for dev, this is for UAT, this is for prod. And then also S3 bucket destination, like I mentioned, so that when code build is running, it will know the S3 bucket destination that it should be uploading the static content to. As I've done in others, I've set up tags over here as well, just so I can make it so it can be easy to identify. And so let me open the S3 bucket over here. And so In this case, it'll be a little bit similar to the S3 bucket I showed you earlier, except we're not configuring it for a website. We're using, as I've commented over here, an S3 bucket used by Code Pipeline for the artifacts. This isn't necessary in our particular context, but so you can know how to set it up. And then the S3 bucket used by Code Build for cache, so that for any time that the pipeline runs after the first success, it would have all of those dependencies already cached that can still be made use of to make it a lot faster in future for any subsequent runs. And then the last resource we're going to cover on the from the module side of things will be Code Pipeline. And so similar, there's some properties which will be a little bit of a no-brainer. We give our Code Pipeline a name, and then we provide it with a role ARN. And then similar to what we did with Code Build, I have a particular role which I'm creating, and I create a trust relationship with the service Code Pipeline, and then proceed to attach permissions to this same role so that it can carry out the relevant actions. So it has a lot of access to, it can carry out all of the actions on S3. And then in addition to that, it also can carry out these actions with Code Build. So starting a build, stopping a build, and getting builds as well. So those would be the permissions that Code Pipeline has. And then next up would be the different stages that we've set up. And so this is a two-stage pipeline. We've got our source, which is, in this case, is from a third party. It is GitHub. And so that token will be, when that token is made use of under the hood by the Terraform data, it will be able to authenticate and be able to pull the relevant details to connect and set up our source over here with our GitHub repository with the relevant details. And over here you can see I've set up some properties for owner, repo, branch, which are a bit of a no-brainer, and OAuth token is obviously based on that token that is stored in Secrets Manager. Poll for source changes is just so that any time that I've pushed to the source, Code Pipeline will be polling that source to know so they can trigger that pipeline based on any changes that have been made. You can set that to false if you want to be manually triggering the pipeline. And then we've got our build stage, which also handles the deploy. And so you can set up your Code Pipeline with different providers. It doesn't have to be Code Build, but in my case, I'm using Code Build. And so it is, the owner would be AWS in this case. And I just give my action a name, and I give it a particular category of build. I set up the artifacts. For the input artifact, it would be source, and the output artifact would be the build artifact in this case. And so this runs in the second order. And again, configuration over here, project name, I reference my Code Build project, which I created. And as you can see, the exported value ARN over here, which I mentioned earlier, the Amazon resource name, is so that it will pull that through after the Code Build project has been created. And like I've done with the other resources, I've set up some tags. So I'm going to close that. And the last thing would be to give you a quick overview, just in one case, of the Teragraph configuration files. I'm going to open one of each just for the dev environment. And so this is what a Teragraph configuration file looks like. And so this allows me, so the inputs block over here allows me to also populate some of the values that I set up in terms of the variables in the relevant module. And so over here, I'm just populating the environment property with dev. And so I do something similar with CI/CD pipeline as well. And then I also provided with the branch name for the development environment I wanted to make use of develop. And the other blocks over here are similar in both configuration files. I include an additional function over here saying find in parent folders. So these are actually child Teragraph configuration files. I have a parent Teragraph configuration file over here, which allows me to set up the provider and by the provider, I mean the type of the cloud provider I'll be using, which in my case is AWS, the region I want to deploy my resources to, and the profile that I'll be using, which should be configured with my machine locally. And it will use that particular profile to deploy the resources to the relevant account. And over here, remote state is so that I can set up the backend state for my entire project so that it can keep track of all of the resources that have been deployed for my infrastructure. And then the other configuration would be similar to what you'd expect above over there, region, the particular region, the profile I'm making use of, the key, which is the path for my S3 bucket, which will be storing my state file And then the bucket itself would be the name of the bucket where my state file will be stored, and the state file contains all of the infrastructure that has been deployed. Lastly, this DynamoDB table is my lock table for state locking, which really isn't important if you're running this by yourself, but that just makes it easier to operate in a team when you're deploying infrastructure. Okay, and so that parent file will be discovered when you set this up over here to find in parent folders. And then lastly, the Terraform block allows me to set up the source for my particular module. And so this will point to the local folder that I've set up over there for the web. This is the Teragraph config file for the web app. And then I can also provide extra arguments. And this is so if I have sensitive information, or I call, I've called a file called sensitive.tfvars where I've populated some additional variables. And so it will make, this command is what will make use of that file to check for any values that haven't been, any variables that haven't been populated because of the sensitive data. And as you can see, it's grayed out over here because I don't commit this. So that's another cool way of running if you want to store variable values that are sensitive in other particular files. Right. And so I've already set up all of this. So I'm going to head over to the AWS cloud to show you what this looks like. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start sharing it again. All right, and so that was the repository. But so here's my pipeline, which I've created. As you can see, it has run successfully, and this is just for the dev pipeline, but I've also created the UAT pipeline, which also succeeded. And so that means that all of the relevant steps run for my file, from my build that I've specified in my build config file. And I'm gonna head over to Cloudfront over here. It means all the static content is in S3. And as you can see over here, I'm on CloudFront, and you can see the relevant origins over here from S3. And then in this tab, I've already opened up the dev environment. So here's the React application, and I'm going to open the UAT one as well. That's prod. So let me open up the UAT one. Let's do that. And so what I've done with the relevant branches is I've just updated this value over here so you can see that I've set it up for the different environments. And lastly would be production. And there you go, the React application is also set up for the production environment. And so the last thing that I would want to quickly show you is the build configuration file inside of the React application. So I'm going to head over to the client application and open the build spec file. And so this is a configuration file that I mentioned earlier. And so as you can see, I've set up Node.js version 12 as my runtime environment. And for pre-build, I install all the relevant dependencies using npm. And then I just have a few commands over here. First, I echo out so that I know the environment that is being executed. And then I echo out run application tests, and then configuring to the CI stage to true. I run npm test so that the React application tests can be run. And only when that is completed, I run npm run build. And then in the post-build phase is where I take all of the content which will be exported to a build file. If you're familiar with working with React, then when you run npm run build, it will export all of the static content into a build folder. And what I do is I recursively copy all of that over to an S3 bucket, which is my S3 bucket destination, as you can see over there. And so these are all the steps that I've configured that will be run through in the code build environment. And that is our project in a nutshell, and that is the talk. I'm gonna head over now to, I'm gonna stop sharing and just see if there are any questions that have come through or anything in the chat. If not, I just hope that that was helpful to you. And like I said, the repository is available. And And so you can go ahead and clone that, and I have added an MIT license so you can make use of it however you see fit. Okay, I see that there aren't any questions at this point. All right, so if there are no questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. You can use @Luke9 for Twitter, and you can use my full name on LinkedIn, and you can get in touch with me if you have any questions that are related to the talk as well. Or if you have any issues on the repository, feel free to log them there as well, and I'll happily assist where I can.